There is a particular kind of morning light that feels different once you've noticed this pattern, softer somehow, almost too gentle for what it's about to reveal. Maybe it's a message the next day, shorter than expected. Maybe it's someone beside you, present in body, but somewhere else entirely in tone. Either way, you feel it before you can name it. A shift that wasn't there hours earlier, warmth replaced by something flatter, quieter, harder to read. And here is the strange part, the part that catches so many people off guard. It is rarely the night itself that leaves you confused. The closeness, the openness, the warmth in the moment, that part usually made sense. What confuses you is the version of them that shows up after, distant where they were once soft, guarded where they were once easy, as if the person across from you now and the person from the night before are only loosely related. You start searching for what changed, replaying words, wondering if you missed some signal, some shift in energy you should have caught sooner. But here's what's worth sitting with before we go any further. This exact experience, this precise morning after distance, doesn't happen occasionally by coincidence. It happens with a consistency that should make you pause, across countless stories, countless people, countless nights that ended in closeness and mornings that began in retreat. Which means the easy explanation, that he simply wasn't interested, was never quite complete. Something else is happening beneath the surface, something that has very little to do with interest at all. So before you spend another moment blaming yourself for a shift you didn't cause, it's worth asking the only question that actually matters here. Why does closeness change someone overnight? You've probably replayed it more times than you'd admit, searching for the exact moment things shifted, wondering if you said too much, revealed too much, let your guard down somewhere you shouldn't have. Maybe you've asked yourself if you were too available, too open, too easy to read once the night gave you permission to be. It feels logical to search there first, inside your own behavior, because that's the only part of the equation you can actually control, and control feels safer than the alternative, which is realizing you had very little to do with it at all. This is the part that deserves to be said plainly. Feeling closer than ever in one moment and completely shut out in the next isn't a sign that something is wrong with how you love. It's a deeply disorienting experience, and disorientation is the reasonable response to something that doesn't add up. Your mind defaults to self-blame not because you're insecure, but because blaming yourself, however painful, at least offers an explanation, and an explanation, even a false one, feels more bearable than the unsettling truth that someone can be present with you and still retreat for reasons that were never about you at all. This is what psychologists sometimes call attribution bias, our tendency to assign meaning to ourselves first, especially after we've allowed someone close enough to matter. Intimacy activates something deeper too, an internal alertness that scans for safety once vulnerability has been offered, because vulnerability, by its very nature, opens you to being hurt, and your mind knows that instinctively. So if you've spent hours or days trying to locate the flaw in yourself that caused someone else's distance, let that search rest for a moment. You didn't misread the night. You're simply standing in the confusion that closeness like this creates. And there is an actual psychological mechanism behind that confusion, one that has far less to do with your worth than you've been assuming, and far more to do with what happens inside someone else the instant real closeness arrives. Distance, as strange as this sounds, is actually the easier state for most people to maintain. It costs very little to stay guarded, composed, slightly curated, because distance never asks anyone to reveal what lies beneath their presentation. Closeness is a different matter entirely. Closeness costs something psychologically, because it requires a person to set down the version of themselves they've carefully built for public consumption, the confident one, the unbothered one, the one who seems to have it together, and simply exist without that armor for a while. Before intimacy, someone can hold an idealized version of who they are, polished, guarded, safely at a distance from anything too raw. Real closeness strips that guarding away, sometimes quickly, sometimes without warning, forcing an encounter with parts of the self that were never built to be witnessed, old fears, unmet needs, unresolved history that armor had been quietly holding back for years. This is where Carl Jung's idea of the shadow becomes essential to understand. The shadow isn't something monstrous or hidden out of malice. It's simply the disowned material of a person, the parts of themselves they've never fully faced, examined, or made peace with. Under normal, guarded circumstances, the shadow stays quiet, tucked safely behind composure. But closeness has a way of cracking that composure open, if only for a night. And once the armor comes down, even briefly, whatever has been sitting underneath doesn't stay hidden. It surfaces, sometimes as need, sometimes as fear, sometimes as something the person themselves doesn't fully recognize or know how to hold. So if closeness is what cracks the armor, and the shadow is what waits behind it, the real question becomes far more revealing than simply noticing someone changed. It becomes this: what exactly comes through that crack once it opens? The first thing that often comes through that crack in the armor isn't disinterest at all, it's shame. And shame behaves very differently than most people expect. It rarely announces itself. It doesn't say, "I feel exposed, I feel too seen, I don't know what to do with how open I just was." Instead, it shows up disguised as distance, as sudden quiet, as a version of someone that seems to have retreated overnight for reasons that appear to have nothing to do with what happened between you. But that retreat is rarely rejection of you. It's an attempt to re-armor against the exposure that just occurred, exposure that, even when wanted, even when good in the moment, can feel unbearable in the light of day to someone who has never made peace with being truly seen. Picture a door left open all night, unlocked, unguarded, allowing something real to pass through it freely. Then morning comes, and there's a frantic, almost involuntary need to shut that door again, not because anything wrong happened inside it, but because being that open was more than the person's internal system was built to comfortably hold. Shame operates differently than guilt in an important way. Guilt says I did something bad, while shame says I am something bad, simply for having been witnessed without the usual defenses in place. Someone caught in shame after intimacy isn't punishing you. They're unconsciously trying to punish, or at least contain, the part of themselves that let too much show. This is sometimes called a vulnerability hangover, that disoriented, slightly raw feeling that follows real emotional exposure. And for people who never learned that being fully seen is safe, that hangover can trigger an urgent need to reconstruct the walls that came down the night before. What you experienced as sudden coldness was very likely someone else's ego scrambling to reconsolidate itself, to feel composed and separate and safely unseen again as quickly as possible. None of this makes what happened fair, and it certainly doesn't make the confusion you felt any less real. But it does mean the distance wasn't a verdict on you, your worth, or what you offered. It was a mirror reflecting someone else's discomfort with their own exposure. And shame is rarely the only mechanism at play here, because once someone feels that exposed, there's often a second, quieter defense that activates right alongside it. One that doesn't just retreat inward, but reaches outward and reshapes the story of what happened entirely. There's a second mechanism that often accompanies shame, and it tends to feel far more personal, because unlike quiet withdrawal, this one sometimes comes with words, subtle ones, but words nonetheless, framing you as somehow too much, too intense, too needy for what happened between you. It's worth understanding exactly what's occurring underneath language like that, because it rarely reflects anything accurate about who you actually were that night. According to Jung, what a person cannot face within themselves doesn't simply disappear, it often gets pushed outward, unconsciously relocated onto someone else, where it becomes easier to see and easier to criticize than it ever was sitting quietly inside them. If someone is deeply uncomfortable with their own need, their own softness, their own capacity to want closeness that badly, that discomfort has to go somewhere, and it is far less threatening to locate it in you than to sit with the unsettling realization that it originates in them. So the encounter quietly gets rewritten. Suddenly you were the one who moved too fast, felt too much, wanted too badly, when in truth, you simply mirrored back a level of openness they couldn't tolerate recognizing in themselves. This is projection, and it functions as a defense, not an observation, a way of externalizing internal discomfort so it never has to be examined directly. It's important to say clearly, this is not an accurate assessment of you, your intensity, or your worth. It's a psychological sleight of hand, moving something uncomfortable from inside someone's own experience onto the nearest available surface, which in this moment happens to be you. Recognizing projection for what it is doesn't require confronting anyone or demanding they see it themselves. It simply requires you to quietly decline to accept a story about yourself that was never actually about you to begin with. But projection alone doesn't explain everything that happens next, because naming you as too much is one thing. Disappearing entirely is another, and that disappearance runs on a different mechanism altogether, one that has less to do with blame and far more to do with a fear most people never learn to recognize in themselves, let alone explain to someone else. The third mechanism is quieter than the first two, and in some ways, harder to recognize, because it doesn't show up as shame or blame. It shows up as absence. For someone whose relationship to intimacy has never fully resolved, closeness doesn't always register as comfort, even when it's wanted, even when it felt good in the moment it happened. For a certain kind of nervous system, closeness can register as something closer to threat, not because you were threatening, but because connection itself, at a certain depth, can feel like a loss of self rather than an addition to it. This is what's often called fear of engulfment, the anxious sense that getting too close to another person might mean disappearing inside that closeness, losing the boundaries that make someone feel like a separate, intact self. It doesn't require you to be overwhelming. It only requires their own sense of autonomy to feel fragile enough that any real intimacy starts to feel like it's asking too much of them. So the instinct to vanish afterward, to go quiet, to create sudden space, is often an unconscious attempt to reclaim that sense of separateness, to remind themselves, almost involuntarily, that they still exist as an individual outside of what was just shared. This has almost nothing to do with your desirability, your worth, or how well the night actually went. It has everything to do with someone's internal architecture, the way they've been wired, often long before you, to associate closeness with a kind of quiet danger rather than safety. People who carry this pattern aren't choosing to punish you by disappearing. They're responding to an old, often unexamined belief that connection costs them something essential, and pulling back is simply how they've learned to protect whatever that essential thing is. Understanding this doesn't excuse the confusion it causes, and it certainly doesn't make the distance any less real. But it does mean the disappearance was never actually about you being too much, or not enough, or anything else you could have controlled. It was about a conflict between autonomy and connection that existed inside them long before you arrived. And once you can see all three of these mechanisms clearly, shame, projection, and fear of engulfment, something deeper starts to become obvious beneath all of them. A single truth that ties every one of these responses together, and it has far less to do with who they became after that night, and far more to do with who you actually were the entire time. Here is the truth waiting beneath everything we've walked through, and it deserves to be said as plainly as possible. What you witnessed that morning was never a mirror reflecting your value back at you. It wasn't proof that you were too much, or not enough, or somehow responsible for a shift you didn't create. It was a window, a brief, unfiltered glimpse into someone else's unfinished relationship with closeness, one that existed long before you and had very little room to include you in its explanation. You didn't do anything wrong by being open. You didn't do anything wrong by being warm, present, willing to let someone close enough to matter. You simply witnessed what happens when real intimacy meets a shadow that hasn't yet been faced, shame surfacing as distance, discomfort surfacing as projection, fear surfacing as disappearance. None of that sequence required you to have failed at anything. Here is the realization that changes how you carry this moving forward. The version of them that appeared afterward, distant, cold, unreadable, was not somehow more true than the version that held you close the night before. It wasn't the real them finally revealed, and the closeness beforehand wasn't a performance you were foolish enough to believe. It was simply less guarded, and less guarded is not the same thing as more honest about who deserves the blame here. A person's shadow surfacing says nothing about your character. It says something about theirs, about work they haven't yet done, fears they haven't yet faced, closeness they haven't yet learned how to hold without retreating from it. You can understand this deeply, hold real compassion for what it must feel like to fear your own exposure that intensely, and still recognize, clearly, that none of it was ever a referendum on you. That clarity is worth protecting, not just as a comforting thought for tonight, but as a steady kind of discernment you carry forward, so the next time closeness meets someone else's unresolved shadow, you'll know, immediately, exactly whose story it actually belongs to. Understanding why someone's shadow surfaced the way it did is valuable, but it's worth being honest about what that understanding is actually for and what it isn't. It isn't a license to excuse a repeated pattern, to keep making room for someone who disappears after closeness again and again, simply because you now have the language to explain why. Insight was never meant to become an invitation to keep absorbing the same disappearance on a loop. Compassion for why someone withdraws is not the same thing as continuing to offer yourself as the rehearsal space for their unresolved fear over and over, while they slowly, maybe, learn how to tolerate real intimacy at your expense. You can hold real empathy for someone's psychology, understand their shame, their projection, their fear of losing themselves in closeness, and still recognize that empathy alone doesn't obligate you to keep investing in someone who hasn't done the work required to meet you consistently. Those two things are not in conflict. Understanding someone deeply and still choosing not to keep absorbing the cost of their unfinished growth. This is where healthy detachment becomes essential, the ability to care about someone's inner world without losing sight of your own. To say, I understand why this happened, and I still won't keep offering myself up to it happening again. That isn't coldness, and it isn't giving up on compassion. It's discernment, and discernment, in moments like this, is simply self-respect wearing a quieter, steadier voice. You're allowed to recognize a pattern the first time it happens and decide, calmly, without drama or explanation, that you won't wait around to confirm it a second or third time. Protecting yourself here doesn't require punishing them for their shadow. It simply requires no longer positioning yourself as the place their shadow gets to keep surfacing without consequence. And the more naturally this discernment becomes part of how you move through closeness, the less often you'll find yourself confused the morning after, because you'll already know exactly what you're willing and unwilling to keep holding space for. There is something worth naming clearly, especially now, after everything this understanding has revealed. Your ability to stay open despite this risk, to still show up warm, present, willing to be close to someone, was never naivety. It was strength, the quiet, uncelebrated kind that doesn't announce itself but shows up anyway, again and again, even after nights that ended in confusion instead of clarity. You are not the one with something to hide from intimacy. You are not the one whose shadow surfaces the moment closeness asks something real of you. That distinction matters more than it might seem in this moment, because it means the fear you witnessed was never a reflection of what you lack. It was a reflection of what someone else hasn't yet faced. Think about who this understanding actually makes you moving forward. Someone who recognizes shame, projection, and fear of engulfment for what they are will no longer absorb someone else's retreat as proof of her own inadequacy. You'll be able to witness distance without immediately writing yourself into the explanation for it. That alone will spare you from carrying weight that was never yours to hold in the first place. This kind of clarity tends to arrive only after paying close, sometimes painful attention, and choosing to understand rather than simply survive what confused you. That's not a small transformation. That's how someone grows into a steadier, more grounded way of loving, not by closing off from closeness to protect herself from ever feeling this again, but by learning to offer real intimacy while remaining fully intact inside it, undiminished by someone else's unfinished psychology. And maybe the quietest, most powerful part of this is simply this: you don't need someone else to resolve their shadow in order for you to feel whole. Your steadiness doesn't wait on their growth anymore. It exists inside you now, independent of whether they ever learn to hold closeness without retreating from it. If any part of this found you at the right moment, let it settle a little longer, not as something to force into resolution, but as a quiet truth you simply carry forward from here.